Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to Africa's North Korea. I think it's Eritrea. I saw in the thumbnail, but I like the channel and he seems to post like informative videos on like countries and what's going on in countries and stuff like that, which I find very fascinating. So we are going to check this out. I don't know much about what's going on in Eritrea. I know it's East Africa, and I feel like East Africa has a lot of conflict. I mean, Sudan's going through it. Somalia has been going through it for a long time, and yeah, I feel like that region of Africa it's not going on. So yeah, I guess Eritrea is just adding to that. But I'm gonna check this out and learn about the situation and what's going on. And that's pretty much it. Links are also in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some reactions that I can't post to YouTube. But let's just jump into this and see a bit about Africa's North Korea.
On November 17th, 1869, this small peninsula suddenly became a new global hotspot. Why? Because a long ditch was dug through it, allowing ships to sail through this route instead of all the way around Africa. Almost overnight, the Red Sea became one of the most strategic regions on Earth to control, or at least have a presence in. One Italian navigation company did just that. They bought the port of Assab from local sultans just 2 days before the grand opening of the canal. Talk about good timing. And today, well, Assab is just a small city in the much larger country of Eritrea, sometimes called Africa's North Korea.
Okay.
Eritrea is an impoverished, highly militarized one-party state. It has been led by a single leader since independence in 1991 and has often been one of the...
That's so sad. They win their independence and it goes to flipping... Just, you get these people in control. You're finally, like, free. You've got your own sort of control, your own destiny. And then these nerds, these evil people just take charge and, yep, there we go. You're back to square one.
bottom nations in terms of human development. Not only does it have the second highest amount of active military reserves per capita, the country has mandatory conscription for both men and women starting from your last year of high school until whenever you're dismissed.
What? That is brutal.
Sometimes when you're 40, sometimes in your 50s. Take that in. That's basically your entire working life as a conscript in the military. Although many of them don't fight because of the unique way Eritrea's government commands its economy. Conscripts are not just used for war. They are quite literally the backbone of everything in the country. They build the country, run the services, administer it, and of course, defend Eritrea. All for very little pay, suffering abuse and harsh conditions in what is essentially a mass system of forced labor. It's no surprise then that Eritrea is also called the world's fastest emptying country.
I mean, there was a girl from Eritrea who went to my school, but I think she lived in the UK since she was born, because you'd speak to her and you'd think she was British because she sounded very British. So she either came very young or she was just born in the UK. But I guess, yeah, there's probably a lot of Eritreans around the world now just leaving, because who's going to want to stay in a country like this where there's no benefits for you to say whatsoever?
Because of how many citizens run away from it. Around 800,000 by 2023. That's in comparison to a home population of only 3.7 million, meaning almost 1/5 of all people born in this land have left it.
Wow.
Real attractive. But is Eritrea actually like North Korea, that crazy hermit kingdom? I don't know. There are some key differences. For one, nukes. Eritrea does not have a nuclear weapons program and thus is much less of a threat than North Korea is. They don't have the capability to straight up destroy their neighbors if the military just feels like it one day. If you were to leave Eritrea, you could come back one day, although with some difficulties. Whereas if you leave North Korea, you're dead to them. Eritreans have a lot more exposure to the outside world through TV and the internet, although the majority still don't have access to them yet, and both are still heavily monitored and regulated by the government. And lastly, Eritrean loyalty is meant to be to the nationalistic, triumphant Eritrean state and military, not to the family that runs it. Still, there are plenty of similarities. We'll run through 4 that I think give you a good picture on the hows and the whys of Africa's North Korea. First, militarism. Look at this fun parade, all the soldiers marching as one. What do you think they might do? Invade Ethiopia? Maybe even Djibouti? I'm not sure, but I can say that Eritrea was a country made by war. even back in the Italian times. Originally, the Italians did not try to grow this dry and rocky colony that much. They wanted control over the fertile interior mountains in East Africa, but were defeated by Ethiopian armies in the 1890s. The land they did keep in Eritrea wasn't all that interesting to them, despite the prime seaside location. Interest came back with a change in government, though. The new fascist Italy was obsessed with trying to reconquer Ethiopia. And where was their starting block to invade? Right here in Eritrea. Suddenly, investment, infantry, and Italians flooded in. The new Italians brought workers to build up urban infrastructure and industry. And that's why Asmara still looks so Italian today and heavily subsidized the colony, bringing in the foreign goods and food they needed. But the, let's say, more conservative-minded fascist Italians also brought new laws with them. The new towns they built were built to be segregated. They limited Eritrean education to only up to the 4th grade, confiscated...
So they've set them up for failure. They're like, oh, god damn. Right, don't get me wrong, the new people there have just continued the trend of like not treating their people right, but this is just horrible. How are you not going to give them these basic rights?
Eritrean cash crop farms and conscripted and trained many citizens to help the fight against Ethiopia. This obviously didn't go over too well with the people, and it created an identity through a shared enemy. Otherwise, this linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and geographically diverse nation probably never would have come together. The newly trained Eritrean soldiers never rebelled against the Italians, though, because the colony was taken over by the British in World War II.
Okay.
The Brits also weren't really interested in administering Eritrea, especially when their empire was in the middle of collapsing. The most they really did was strip Italian-made assets and deport many of the fascist administrators who ran the colony. Many Italians left the colony in this period, so in the end, the UK and UN came to an agreement in 1952 to just make Eritrea an autonomous region of neighboring Ethiopia. Funny they did that. Even funnier when they were slowly annexed by the Ethiopian Empire, officially voting Eritrea out of existence in 1962.
Damn.
Eritreans
They voted them out. Jeez.
became second-class citizens in the empire. Independence leaders were harassed or killed, and political parties, the press, and unions were crushed under Ethiopian rule. So if you thought the rebellious military culture was made under fascist Italy, you were wrong. A 30-year war followed this. 30 years, yes, 3 decades. The final straw being the fact that they would no longer teach the majority language Tigrinya in school, instead opting for Amharic, the language of the Ethiopian government. Resistance started off as a Muslim movement, but then spread to workers and spread even further to a general nationalist movement. Eventually, this movement split up, with the most successful successor being the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. Fighting lasted through the Cold War with all of its shenanigans. It was decades of fighting, massacres, razings, mass burnings, sometimes even between Eritreans, and as time went on, the Eritreans continued fighting in a way that the Ethiopians were getting tired of. Fighting alongside the Tigray PLF, funds and equipment dropping off at the end of the Cold War, and battles won in the mountains led to Eritrean victory and a declaration of independence.
So you're thinking, they get the victory, it's only up now. You've got what you've been fighting for. The only way is up. It's looking good now. Let's go. Let's see what happens.
In 1991. And now, everyone's happy and peaceful.
Yeah.
The revolutionary fighters could now focus on governing their newly made country. The EPLF became the PFDJ, the People's Front for Democracy and Justice. What a that would be. So did the fighting stop after independence? No.
See that piss? Oh my god! They fight for this just to get, basically just done all that just to get control for themselves, lying to the people, doing all that, and then yep, you're now in charge of all these people, and you're gonna ruin all of their lives and probably make it just as bad, if not worse.
This is when they made their mandatory conscription, although for the time it was only 18 months long and didn't control their entire society. Most new government officials were commanders and officers in the fight for independence. They knew how to run an army, but not a country. After independence, Eritrea was involved in a small war with Yemen, the First Congo War, the Second Sudanese Civil War, a war in Djibouti, got sanctioned after that one, and a real doozy in Ethiopia.
God, it's just this region really just does go through it, man.
From 1998 to 2000. You see, The TPLF eventually installed a government in Ethiopia, and even though they fought with the Eritreans for independence, the two movements did not get along. The government has always had this idea that the TPLF is trying to destabilize Eritrea and remove them from power. So relations between the countries soured throughout the 90s, the two countries stopped trading, had border skirmishes, and an outright war broke out in 1998 over the tiny village of Badme. Although it only lasted for 2 years, conflict between them was on and off for 2 decades until a formal peace treaty was signed with the new Ethiopian government in 2018. Hope! Not for long though. In 2020, they joined the Ethiopia-Tigray civil war, fighting once again with their compatriots. Just kidding. They were fighting with Ethiopia against the TPLF again. They blocked food shipments from the sea, pillaged villages, murdered citizens, and even did this to their own Eritrean refugee camps, all in an effort to officially crush the TPLF. So if you were to add up all the wars, all the people affected, moved, or killed by constant warfare in this tiny country, it would be a lot of people. Eritrea was made by war. Second is power. I should tell you more about the government. In general, I guess you could call them paranoid, isolationist, and brutal with their punishments. Particularly this guy is Isaias Afwerki. He's been at least as long as I can remember, as long as anyone can remember. That's because if we're going off the perspective of the Eritrean nation, he's been president forever for 100% of the independent history.
That is so fascinating to me, man.
Rule a country since 1991 without having some typical dictatorial characteristics. He was a through and through military commander who became president. He spearheaded the war efforts, was paranoid about foreign powers, arrested opposition leaders, and arrested many of his own citizens for arbitrary and unknown reasons. One of the most common ways to do this was to detain dozens of people at a time inside of these shipping containers. Better pray it doesn't get too hot out.
Oh my god, that sounds hellish, man. I mean, it's gonna get you can see how hot it gets. Oh man, being stuck in a fucking hell, that is brutal.
Outside, damn, these metal prisons get hot. We're talking potentially up to the 60s or 70s degrees Celsius.
We're just getting cooked inside. That is actually vile.
And this barely scratches the surface of all the torture and abuse the soldiers face. Maybe Isaias isn't a great dude. So if there was any point where all hope of a reasonable development plan was lost, it was definitely 1998, the militarization of society. The ongoing war with Ethiopia was an excuse to extend conscription from 18 months to, well, they just say indefinitely, but it's usually around 25 to 30 years of service, aka your whole working career in forced labor. Slowly, the government eroded the powers of society and the people. Elections in 1997 were postponed to 2001 due to the war, and then postponed again because part of the country was occupied at the time. I guess we're still waiting for this one to happen because there have been no elections since independence.
And they just get away with it. That is so weird to me. How can you just... They've just straight up lied. I mean, that is how it is, right? But they don't care anymore. They probably realize now they've got all the power. They can just do what they want. But it's just wild, so wild that they can just get away with these lies. These lies that are so blatant and obvious.
Even in local elections, the last ones took place in 2003. The PFDJ doesn't even trust small-town mayors. Newspapers were shut down in 2001, and yes, journalists have of course been high on the list of citizens arrested and detained for challenging Isaias. The list that also includes many entrepreneurs and business owners. Those that ran shops that weren't PFDJ owned and operated. Yup, into the shipping containers they went. There have even been reports of soldiers going door to door under the pretext of data collection or asking how service is going for the family, but is really to identify draft dodgers and those who fled the country. And to flee the country, you have to get through heavily guarded borders, either through bribery or gunfire, or just see where the ocean takes you. Many times, if they catch you doing this, they'll get a family member to replace you in conscription or just arrest a family member as punishment. So I don't know. Personally, to me, Isaias doesn't really seem like a stable guy. I might even go as far to say that he and the PFDJ have ruined the nation. But hey, not everything is politics. There's always the economy, right? So third, command. How is that economy? Well, it's a little different to how it works in the US or Europe or India or even China, which claims to be what Eritrea actually is, and that's a command economy. Almost everything, at least in the cities, is run by the PFDJ and the conscripts working for them. I say in the cities because more accurately, it's a dual economy, one based on government command and the other on subsistence farming. So this GDP per capita number might not be too accurate when talking about the Eritreans. In cities like Asmara, Karen, and Assab, the PFDJ rules all. I mean all. Private business is outlawed in the nation. Instead, many farms, businesses, administration, and services are run by, yes, you guessed it, the conscripts. For example, all private construction companies were banned in 2006, and the government even went so far to demolish already built homes because they were financed from foreign money by a private
What the fuck?
firm. So infrastructure is weak. Only a fifth of the country's roads are paved.
This is what I don't understand. Why are they going this route? Surely you're going to benefit everyone so much more if you just go in a way where you're not just trying to benefit the elite at the top. Because even then, if you just like try and like have rules and structure the country in a way that benefits everyone, you're going to be benefited more as well. I just don't really understand why this is the way, like the route that countries will go a lot of the time when they'll gain their independence and this and that. Like, it just doesn't really make sense to me. And I don't think it's supposed to make sense. That's the whole point of it. But
History hasn't made people richer. Property rights are borderline non-existence. But hey, at least forcing people to learn how to read does actually improve the literacy rate. So that's one good thing they've done. The PFDJ and military essentially have a monopoly on all trade, construction, markets, mining, and cash crops in Eritrea. In fact, most of the trade leaving is from government-owned mines selling to China and the Emirates. Most of the stuff coming into Eritrea is a little more essential to life, especially this category, food. Although the country claims to be self-reliant in food production, often rejecting aid, their imports clearly suggest otherwise. Forcing people to run farms they don't want to is one way to curb food production, but it might not be entirely their fault. Eritrea is a dry country with a very little amount of arable land. Most of the food going out of the nation is a small amount of cash crops like bananas and peppers, but most of the food coming in are staple foods eaten every day. When you zoom in, most of the food production seems to be for small-scale domestic eating, almost on a subsistence level, which is where most people work. Most Eritreans do not live in urban centers. They live on small farms or pastoral land. Small villages that depend on family units instead of the PFDJ for welfare. Of course, when drought and soil erosion hits, these are the people most affected by food and water shortages. But they're also often the ones least affected by the business bans, setting up what are called micro-businesses in small towns in the cities. Basically just market stands of their crop making ends meet in the cash-based informal economy. So besides the market vendors working for cash, what do the conscripts work for? I'll let General Sabat Ephraim, Minister of Defense and Mining, explain it for me. Even though each of the conscripts has between 2 and 3 children, they only receive 500 nafka per month. How do they do it? Their reward is not a salary because the amount they receive is insignificant. Instead, patriotism is the driving force. If a private firm were to take over, it would be solely driven by pecuniary interest rather than by patriotism. In the beginning, the conscript will be happy to receive 100 nafka, but
oh my god. So they're what, receiving not even $400 a year? A year, that is fucking insane. Oh, you just have to feel blessed that you're not born in a country like this where you're just given basically no chance at all.
soon after, he will demand more. In the end, money will dictate everything. Nothing can be accomplished in this way. Patriotism will drive the country, all while the ones who own the mines and businesses make a fortune off of free labor and won't reinvest the profits back into infrastructure or the people. Maybe patriotism will drive the people to work for only $30 a month, but it also seems to drive them out of the country in mass numbers, which has led Eritrea to 4. Isolation. A lot of Eritreans live outside of their closed borders. One thing that means is that a lot of Eritreans send money back home to their families, called remittances. Despite the whole self-reliance thing, it's estimated that around 20 to 40% of the GDP comes from these remittances. In a country with a large level of poverty, little to no pay, low foreign reserves, and food insecurity, remittances are a way for many to keep their heads above water, maybe even to build up some savings to, I don't know, flee themselves one day. The government does try to restrict them though. A family can only withdraw up to 5,000 NAFKA in cash every month, around $330. That's not a whole lot to subsist with, so some argue remittances have not helped to develop Eritrea. They've just stabilized an unstable economy built off of forced labor. Pretty ironic for a country so insistent on its self-reliance from the outside world. Another irony, the diaspora tax. Every Eritrean refugee is supposed to pay 2% of the money they make outside of the country back to the Eritrean government.
What? I mean, surely the countries that they're in will just block that. They're not going to get caught up in that. Like, I'm assuming that's the case.
It's one of only a few countries on earth to tax their citizens living outside of the nation. I'm looking at you, America. Considering how many refugees there are, that's got to be a pretty big portion of the government's revenue, right? Maybe. The government does not share their income or budget. The Hidri Trust Fund controls all state enterprises, although no external monitoring is allowed of it. So not even the...
So if you don't pay your tax and you're from Eritrea and you live in the UK, what's going to happen to you? Because I'm assuming the UK won't care. I mean, they're not going to stop that, are they? They're not going to try and be like, oh, you have to pay this. I mean, unless I'm wrong, but when it's a country like this where you're just escaping, I don't really know how they would just still force you to pay the tax or whatever.
Ministry of Finance knows where the money goes. Still, we could assume this tax makes up a pretty big chunk of the budget. PFDJ run businesses don't pay tax, and neither do the hard to reach rural populations. But 60% of outside Eritreans report at least sometimes paying the 2% tax, and almost all said they send remittances to their families. Small scale family financing
I guess that makes sense. Sending stuff to your family, so maybe you'd have to pay tax, and that does kind of make sense there.
likely has a bigger impact than the government's tax collection and payments. It's a confusing system. I can't tell you everything about the economy, but I think this quote from a fled minister sums it up pretty well. In the beginning, I thought the diaspora tax was justified, but over the past 20 years, there has not been a visible thing done in Eritrea. We don't know where the money goes. When I worked at the Ministry of Finance, I was involved in diaspora tax issues. The Ministry of Finance has no control over the spending of the money. It also does not control the mining income. In the end, it is the President's office and the head of PFDJ's financial affairs that control everything. The PFDJ has a lot of companies. They don't pay tax. They are like the private property of the ruling elite. Does it raise questions that most of the info we get about these systems are from those who clearly didn't like the country enough to run away? Sure. I'm sure there are some that exaggerate how bad Eritrea is to get more attention than trying to be totally honest. But doesn't it raise more questions when there is barely any information coming out of the country in the first place? Maybe it's just me, but I think I'm more inclined to believe the refugees' stories. Stories of conscription, war, command, power held by a few, and self-reliance. That's what makes people call Eritrea Africa's North Korea. Shout out to Yao for inspiring this.
Jesus Christ, man, this place, I didn't know it was like this at all. It makes you realise, man. My mother left Eritrea in the late 80s and doesn't talk much about her time there, as she was conscripted at the age of 15 during the 30-year war and still has PTSD of it. Thank you for this video. This is so wild, man. These poor people. The Eritrean government took the phrase "militaries with a state" very seriously. Once met a girl and her family who told me the story of how they escaped Eritrea. It makes you realise, man, people who are leaving these countries, like, they really are just trying to get anywhere where there's a bit of, just a chance, you know, they're giving them a bit of a chance. When people are born into these situations, how can anyone blame them? That is horrible to me. Flipping hell, man. How to run a country poorly, that's what I've just watched here. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this. If you're from Eritrea, or if you've just known and you study about, you just know about the country and the problems here. Yeah, I'm assuming there's no time anytime soon that it's going to be stopping, but it is pretty shocking. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and until next time, peace.